Number 24 takes us to East Africa, a diverse place sometimes called the cradle of humanity. Today, we're going to explore Tanzania. Geography. Definitions of East Africa vary. Mine, for instance, is different from the United Nations. A convenient dividing line is the East African Rift, where magmatic forces are literally tearing the continent apart along a series of valleys. One day, East Africa will be a separate island or group of islands across a narrow channel from the rest of Africa. This rift system actually splits in two, south of Ethiopia, a western branch, the Albertine Rift, and an eastern branch, the Gregory Rift. After ringing the East African Plateau, they meet again in the south of Tanzania, joining to form Lake Malawi. In fact, much of the rifts are filled with lakes, the largest being Lake Tanganyika, a name of uncertain origin, maybe Bantu for Great Plain Lake, after its large size. The lake is a mile, nearly a kilometer and a half, deep. Lake Victoria, the largest in Africa, is in contrast much shallower, apparently formed when eastward streams were dammed by the rising mountains of the Gregory Rift. Besides the rifts, the most dramatic feature of Tanzania is Mount Kilimanjaro in the north. Chaga for unclimbable, this is Africa's tallest mountain, almost 20,000 feet, 6,000 meters above sea level. It is a dormant volcano and has in fact been climbed many times, but is so tall that despite being close to the equator, its summit is covered in glaciers, though they have retreated considerably within the past 100 years. Because of Tanzania's location just south of the equator on the eastern side of Africa, the Intertropical Convergence Zone, a belt of low air pressure and rainfall, passes over the country twice in a year, creating a short wet season, October to December, and a long wet season, March to May, in the north of the country. The south has a more consistent, one long wet season. The semi-arid eastern half of the plateau experiences rain shadow from either side, while the mountains are a cooler, temperate climate. A narrow strip of forest, savanna, and swamps occupy the coast, giving way to drier inland Miombo woodlands. The central drylands are covered in shrubs, savanna, and grass, the many mountains in rich, dense forest, while valley floors are filled by large wetlands. This all comes together to create a biodiversity hotspot, home to at least 1/5 of all the large mammals in Africa. They remain protected in over a dozen reserves and parks, most famous of all, the Serengeti. Earliest humans and the East African Bushmen. I've brought it up a few times. Now I ought to talk more about the origin of humans. Based on fossil and genetic evidence, the ancestors of humans and chimpanzees diverged somewhere between 13 and 5 million years ago, before the onset of the Ice Age. Study of human evolution has to suffer fragmentary fossils for a fragmentary picture, but it's assumed 2.5 million years ago the first true human evolved in East Africa. It would have looked something like an odd ape man to us, but it is the earliest species known to have used primitive stone tools. This is Homo habilis, handyman, who roamed the savannas of the East African Rift. Habilis begat Homo erectus, who walked upright, and spread across the Old World tropics by 1 million years ago. There are a lot of described human specimens that may or may not be distinct species, but in Africa, erectus is thought to have become Homo heidelbergensis, ever more human-like. Some 300,000 years ago, we, Homo sapiens, the thinking man, evolved. Where exactly is the big question? Based on fossils, archaeology, and genetics, it seems to be, at least mostly, in Africa, somewhere between South Africa and Kenya. I've been showing it about Tanzania, which would make this country pretty darn special as our original home. Man spread out beyond Africa, mingling with other humans in Africa and Eurasia, until eventually only we were left. But that was tens of thousands of years ago, a huge amount of time. Since then, the many populations of men have diverged and coalesced into distinct lineages, which is what I'm referring to when I use the term race. Many of these races look similar and have similar skin tones, especially in Africa. But in Tanzania, we see a cline of two particular races. We've met the Khoisan in southern Africa. But in East Africa, around Ethiopia, an East African race lived. The natives of Tanzania become a mixed folk of both ancestries, with a little Central African pygmy thrown in there. They survive today, after all the history that has washed over Tanzania, speaking their ancient languages. Like the Khoisan languages, they have click consonants, otherwise almost entirely unknown anywhere else. For a time, these East African Bushmen were included in the Khoisan, but don't seem to be closely related. Their relations remain thousands and thousands of years in the distant past. Kushites, Nilotes, and Bantu. The Bushmen lived across the savannas, preying on the abundant game of Tanzania, until peoples north and west began to stir and encroach on their home. Like the Chadians we met in Cameroon, the Kushites are speakers of languages part of a wider family called Afro-Asiatic. More on all that in later episodes. The Kushites are actually the result of an ancient migration of non-Africans, either through Egypt or across from Arabia, who then mingled with the East Africans. They acquired our friends' cattle, sheep, and goats from the Middle East and continued to exploit the savanna for pasture. By 5,000 years ago, they reached Tanzania, probably driven by the drying of the Horn of Africa as the Green Sahara faded away. Today, their presence stops at Tanzania, but Kushites very well may have continued further south across the Zambezi, admixing with the Khoisan there, becoming the Khoi, if you remember them from previous episodes. That would explain their lifestyle and DNA, which has a non-European Eurasian component. After the Kushites come Nilotes. I use this term in two ways, a broad sense for the Ice Age era stock race from which the narrow sense Little Nilotes arose from. These Nilotes are an Eastern Sudanian people who stayed behind in the Upper Nile as others like Central Sudanians and Saharans withdrew elsewhere. Again, they'll get more attention in future episodes. By 3,000 years ago, the Nilotes have expanded into the Rift Valley of Kenya as the Southern Nilotes. By the mid-1st millennium BC, they've broken into the Tanzania Rift, displacing some of the Kushites and cleaving them off as a distinct southern branch. Our famous regulars, the Bantu, are next. After expanding across the Congo Basin, by the beginning of the Christian era, they have moved into Tanzania, entering either or both north and south of Lake Tanganyika. As a fierce iron-working farming people, they took the best land from all those who came before, relegating the pastoral Kushites and Nilotes to pockets in the Gregory Rift. The Kushites split into two northern groups, the Iroquois and Gorowa, a southern Burunga, and the Nilotes here become the Datoga. Meanwhile, two holdouts of East African Bushmen survived, the Sandawe of the middle Budu River and the Hadza along the eastern shore of Lake Eyasi. The Dahalo speak a Cushitic language that is highly unusual, suggesting they are a third group that adopted a foreign language. Several centuries later, we can say the Bantu split into overgroups. The dual routes of Bantu migration into Tanzania created two. The southern Lacustrian Bantu in the valleys of the Malagarasi, Rufiji, and Ruvuma rivers, and Lake Rukwa, and the northeastern Bantu in an arc from the lands between the Great Lakes to those east of the Rift Valley. Very soon, however, the northern Lacustrian Bantu cleave off west of the Gregory Rift. Soon afterwards, each breaks up further. The northern Lacustrian Bantu divide into the western branch in the highlands southeast of Lake Albert, the West Nyanza west of Lake Victoria, East Nyanza southeast of the lake, and the Luya northwest. Northeastern Bantu become the Thagiku in the Kenyan highlands, the Chagataita along the highlands around Mount Kilimanjaro, and those of the northeast coast. The southern Lacustrian Bantu become the Rukwa along that lake and the highlands between lakes Tanganyika and Malawi, the upper Ruaha in the upper Ruaha River, the Rufiji Ruvuma in the valleys of those respective rivers, the Kalambaro in the Kalambaro Valley, the Takama in the valley of the Malagarasi, and the Tongwe in the lower Malagarasi and hills facing Tanganyika. Fast forward to the end of the first millennium, and Tanzania's demographics become ever more complex. The Rukwa split into the western branch of the Ufipa Plateau and valleys south, the central Rukwa between the lake and Kipengere Mountains, and the eastern Rukwa along the north shore of Lake Malawi. Likewise, the Rufiji Ruvuma split in twain as the Rufiji and Ruvuma. Northeast coast Bantu become the Ruvu along the Ruvu and Wami rivers, Ceuta in the lower Pangani, the Asu in the upper Pangani, and the Sabaki along the Sabaki and Tana rivers. The Chaga Taita split into the Chaga of Mount Kilimanjaro and the Taita of the Taita Hills. A group of Takama migrate east of the Rift Valley, assimilating Burunge there and becoming the Rangi people. The East Nyanza splinter into north and south, and the Suguti in the peninsula north of Speke Gulf. Along the northwestern shore of Lake Victoria, the West Nyanza become their northern branch, while the rest become the Rutara people. and the western northern lacustrine Bantu east of Lake Kivu coalesce into the highland Kivu people, opposite the forest Kivu. The lands between Kivu and Victoria turned out to be incredibly fertile. This, coupled with developments along the eastern coast of Africa, enabled the rise of powerful chieftains, culminating in the emergence of the ancient Rutara Empire of Kitara. Those Rutara who remained free south of the Kagere River become the Ragwe. But all that will have to wait for a future episode. Swahili and Kilwa. Back in Mozambique, we talked at length about the Swahili people, and we're going to do it again, because Tanzania is a Swahili kind of country. As early as the 1st century, Greek merchants knew of a port somewhere south of Arabia called Hrapta, in the land of Azania, a source of ivory. The Indian Ocean trade almost certainly goes back even further, the Azanians trading their white gold for Indian spices and Chinese silks. By 1000 AD, Zimbabwean gold and Zambian copper joined the trade, compounded by the export of slaves, whom the Muslim empires of the Middle East used for a wide range of purposes, from household servants to soldiers. Azania became Zanj, a word related to Persian for black, Arabic for foreign, or even Chinese. No one's really sure. But Arabs and especially Persians from Shiraz voyaged to exotic Zanj, encountering strange beasts and people in the wild lands of Africa. As always happens, some stayed behind and took native wives, beginning a new mixed Arab, Persian, Bantu, Muslim people, the Swahili. A new Muslim civilization arose, speaking a Sabaki language written in Arabic letters, importing Islamic literature, art, architecture, mathematics, sailing, all the achievements of the Islamic Golden Age. Thus did East Africa join the great sphere of Muslim civilization, and so proud were and are this coastal Bantu people that they refer to themselves as the Waangwana, the civilized ones. To Arabs, they were known as Swahili, the coastmen. By the 12th century, a string of cities dotted the coast: Malindi, Mombasa, Unguja, Kilwa, Lindi, continuing on to Mozambique and even the Comoros. By the 14th, the Sultanate of Kilwa had subjugated the rest into a great empire. The wealth of Kilwa, gathered from the ivory, slave, and gold trades, impressed famed Moroccan explorer Ibn Battuta when he visited Sultan al-Hassan in 1330. Kilwa itself was then a great city of stone, endowed with a grand mosque. But inevitably, ambitious governors, palace intrigues, and coups undermined the empire's stability. By 1500, mighty Kilwa broke into 5 successor states: Sofala, Mozambique, Mombasa, Malindi, and the rump of Kilwa itself. Further peopling. Inland, meanwhile, the Ragwe formed their own kingdom of Karagwe, and a western Nilotic people called the Luo migrate from the north and settle the Wenam Gulf. Sometime during the Middle Ages, an archaeological culture called the Sirikwa settled east of the Gregory Rift. Based on their lifestyle, they likely were eastern Nilotes from Lake Turkana, who become the Maasai. And other groups are splitting up. There are a lot. Let's get this party started. The western Rukwa become a sort of dual people, the Mambwe and Lungu in the upper Mtembwa River, the Nyamwanga in the lower, the Wanda in the lower Momba River, the Rungwa in the Rungwa and Katuma rivers, and the Fipa in the Ufipa. The central Rukwa likewise split into Bungu north of Lake Rukwa, Nyiha along the upper Momba, Lambia, Malila, and Safwa in the valleys northwest of the Kipengere. Eastern Rukwas become the Nyakyusa along Lake Malawi, and the Ndali upwards of them. Those of the upper Ruaha become a host of peoples, largest the Sangu in the upper valley, the Hehe in the lower, and the Bena in the Kipengere, along with smaller peoples the Kinga, Wanj, Pangwa, Kisi, and Manda. The Kalambaro split into a southern Pogolo and northern Mbunga. So too go the Ruvuma as the upper Yao and lower Makonde. And you guessed it, the Rufiji break into the Matengo along the Ruhuhu River, the Ndendeule in the Luwengo Valley, the Ngindu in the upper Rufiji, and the Ndengereko in the lower. The Chakama become the 5 tribes of the Nyamwezi, the Sukuma, the Sumbwa, the Yeke, the Konongo, and the Kimbu. The Ruvu become the Zaramo along that river, the Kwaire at the lower Wami, the Luguru at the middle, and the Gogo in the upper. The Seota split into northern Shambhala and southern Zigula. The northeast Nyanza do a threefold division: Suba along the shore, northern Gusi, and southern Kuria. The south branch likewise become a western Zanaki, northern Ungurimi, and the southern Ikoma. So, why all the effort? Well, something like 120 languages are spoken in Tanzania. I don't want anyone to feel left out, though obviously I had to lump a few together. When your country is fertile and geographically diverse, peoples find it easier to break off into their own little groups. Jungle, hills, and mountains make Africa really good at that. Sultanate of Zanzibar. Okay, back to the coast. If you're a long-time viewer, you'll know 1488, Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias reached the Cape of Good Hope, and by 1498, Vasco da Gama stopped along the Swahili coast on his way to India. By then, Kilwa's empire had collapsed, and Portugal was able to take advantage of the situation, impressing local rulers with their cannons, guns, and ships. 1500, the Sultan of Malindi became a vassal to Portugal, and aided the Portuguese in their conquest of the Swahili coast. 1505, Kilwa and Sofala fall. 1507, Mozambique, and 1528, Mombasa accepts Portuguese overlordship, all under the Portuguese Viceroy of India. With their advanced sailing technology, a hefty amount of guns, and strategic trading posts across Asia and Africa, Portugal was then able to dominate all the trade from the Orient to Europe, amassing considerable wealth. Such riches attracted Turkish privateers in the Indian Ocean, but Portugal held strong. Wars with the Dutch, however, were a different matter. Oman took advantage, rising as a new maritime power in the Arabian Sea. 1698, she conquered Fort Jesus on Mombasa Island, wresting the Swahili coast north of the Ruvuma. The remainder, of course, evolves into the colony of Mozambique. Portugal licks her wounds and focuses on Brazil. Omanis began colonizing their new possession, building a fort on the largest island of Unguja. The city, island, and archipelago then became known as Zanzibar, the Zanj coast. I should also mention, while we're here, that further west around the Great Lakes some kingdoms have been rising, most important Rwanda, Burundi, and Buganda, but we'll cover those in later episodes. Highland Kivu, left out of those kingdoms in modern Tanzania, become the Ha. Also, from our Malawi days, Ngoni, fleeing the ravages of Shaka Zulu, make their way to the west shore of Lake Malawi in 1835, establishing their own raiding kingdom, and shortly cross the lake to the upper Ruvuma. At King Zwangandaba's death in 1848, these Ngoni split off as the Gwangara. Anyways, by 1840, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, Omani Sultan Said relocated his court to Zanzibar. At his death in 1856, his will divided the realm. His son Majid then became ruler of a separate Sultanate of Zanzibar. There were quarrels about the arrangement, but the British in India settled the matter. European pressure had forced Zanzibar to restrict its slave trading, but some enterprising adventurers found an alternate source of income. We've met them before. The Zanzibari Tipo Tip, who founded an ivory trading empire along the Lualaba River in Congo, and the Yeke Msiri, who built his kingdom of Garanganze in the High Congo on the sale of copper. The powerful Nyamwezi tribes controlling the trade between the interior and Zanzibar fought one another to increase their shares. German East Africa. It was in this environment that Europeans began engaging with the country east of Lake Tanganyika. Treatments for tropical diseases, and a cultural mood to explore and document the world, and extend national dominions, energized Europeans for discovery. German missionary and explorer Johannes Rebmann made it to Mounts Kilimanjaro and Kenya by 1849, and studied the native peoples. Englishmen Richard Francis Burton and John Henning Speke, searching for the source of the Nile, found it at Lake Victoria in 1858, which they named after the then Queen of Britain. The Swahili call it Ukerewe, Rwanda and Burundi, Nyanza. And most famous of all, Dr. David Livingstone went missing somewhere in the dark heart of Africa, and explorer, adventurer extraordinaire Henry Morton Stanley was sent to find him. He did, in 1871, in a small village along Lake Tanganyika named Ujiji. Upon seeing the palest man in East Africa, Stanley exclaimed, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." By the second half of the 19th century, Britain and France were the premier powers in Africa, followed distantly by Portugal and Egypt. Fearing they would be cut off from the many millions of potential customers now known to live in the interior, German merchant organizations began lobbying their government for action. As we remember from Namibia and Cameroon, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck wasn't interested in foreign adventure, preferring to focus on Europe and not provoke Britain and France. but public pressure wanted Europe's third industrial titan to join in the imperialism game, and Bismarck finally acquiesced. Merchant concerns motivated the establishment of colonies on the western coasts of Africa. On the east coast, a particularly cavalier German named Karl Peters personally journeyed to Zanzibar in 1884, attempting to gain permission from chiefs just west to establish some kind of territory for his Society for German Colonization. Peters demanded official protection from the government, and Bismarck found it in accordance with his new revised strategy. The Berlin Conference was called in 1884 to divide up the continent. Germany was careful not to be too greedy. On the east coast, her ambitions were limited to a block of territory between the shore and Lake Tanganyika. She and Britain agreed to divide Zanzibar between themselves. Thus, the Swahili coast was split amongst the three powers of Britain, Germany, and Portugal. 1885, Karl Peters founded the German East Africa Company, die Deutsch-Ostafrikanische Gesellschaft, with an official charter from the Chancellor to colonize Germany's claim. Sultan Bargash took issue with this, of course, but a squadron of German warships changed his mind. He soon granted a lease for the mainland to both the DOAG and its British counterpart, the Imperial British East Africa Company. 1886, Germany and Britain agreed to respect the Sultan's sovereignty and roughly divide their spheres, about just south of Mombasa. The same year, Germany also concluded a treaty with Portugal, establishing the border with Mozambique, along the Rovuma River to its confluence with the Masinga, thence due west to Lake Malawi. In exchange, Germany endorsed Portugal's claims to the lands between Mozambique and Angola, though we know what that amounted to. Zanzibar's control of the mainland soon became just a formality when in 1888 both companies effectively annexed their portions. The Abushiri revolt tried to stop this, but was crushed in 1890. The same year, Germany and Britain signed the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty, by which Britain traded the small island of Heligoland in the North Sea for free reign in Zanzibar. Colonial borders were decided, with the one between German and British East Africa running from just north of Pemba Island, northwest, south along a floodplain, then north over Mount Kilimanjaro, northwest again to the shore of Lake Victoria at the 1st degree south latitude, thence due west to the border with Congo Free State. Southwest, the border ran along the Songwe River, then some lines and ridges to finally the Colombo River down to Lake Tanganyika. This separated East Africa from the future Nyasaland and northern Rhodesia, giving German East Africa a good, solid shape. The islands of Zanzibar were then left with no choice but to accept British protection, while Germany directly took their mainland portion and the islands of Mafia. 1896, Zanzibar tried to reassert her sovereignty, but a war with Britain that lasted about 38 minutes put those plans to bed. The former Zanzibari city of Dar es Salaam, the abode of peace, became the new capital, but in 1891 the German government decided that the DOAG was incapable of governing the territory and annexed East Africa directly to the Crown. They established control over the trading hub of Tabora that year, but much of the south remained defiant. 1894, a small sliver of land south of the Rovuma River, the Kionga Triangle, was taken from Portugal by basically bullying the poor nation. 1896, a mutiny in the Congo Free State left a power vacuum in the Lake Kivu region, and Germany moved in, accepting the submission of Little Burundi. The next year, Rwanda followed suit. 1898, Chief Mkwawa of the Hehe is defeated by the Germans, assisted by rival tribes. And 1900, the Kingdom of Karagwe joins German East Africa. 1905, many of the natives felt difficulties in adjusting to the German authorities' demands, like forcing them to work on plantations and pay taxes, and launched a widespread revolt across the south, the Maji Maji, including the Yao, Ngindu, and Gwangara Ngoni. It was finally put down in 1907, Governor Gustav Adolf von Goetzen using brutal methods with his native Askari soldiers and scorched earth tactics. All in all, some 300,000 people died, either in violence or famine, mirroring the concurrent Nama and Herero genocide in German southwest Africa. 1910, the Kivu frontier incident is settled, and Germany, Britain, and Belgium adjust their borders, still along the 1st degree south latitude, until it reaches the Kagera River, all the way to the Muvumba River, separating East Africa from Uganda. Mass death of natives aside, Germany did attempt to develop its new colony, building railroads and turning Dar es Salaam into a model city. Few Germans came to settle the tropical country, instead investing in plantations, growing everything from cotton, rubber, coffee, But the most profitable was sisal, a type of agave. Its fibers are used for all kinds of things. Germany also abolished slavery, in stages, which ironically peeved a lot of African landowners and aggravated an already chronic shortage of labor. Germany had problems trying to impose a modern European market economy and civil society on a colony of millions of Africans who lived traditional subsistence lives in clan villages. In all, German East Africa made Germany very little money in the long run, validating Bismarck's worries. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Germany was far more concerned about the European theater. Even so, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led his Askari warriors in a daring guerrilla campaign against the British, Belgians, and Portuguese. His forces were undefeated and tied down hundreds of thousands of Entente forces. He only finally surrendered in 1918 when he learned that Germany had agreed to armistice. German East Africa would then be occupied by Britain, Belgium, and Portugal, and in the 1919 Treaty of Versailles divided between the three. Portugal got back its little Kionga Triangle, while Belgium managed to secure the highlands it occupied during the war. The districts of Rwanda and Burundi were sliced off and given to Belgium as Rwanda-Urundi, following the Kagera River, becoming the Nyabarongo River, following some lines and rivers to the Ruvubu River, along more small streams, then up the Moyo-Wosi River, over a ridge, then southwest to the Lugusi River, down to the Rupungwe River, then up the Malagarasi to its source, then across to Lake Tanganyika. The remainder of East Africa passed to Britain, and these two League of Nations mandates were designated Class B. In Cameroon, I made a mistake. There were three classes of mandates. Class A were in the Levant, intended to be made independent at some point. Class B, like East Africa and Cameroon, were to be autonomous territories of their respective overlords, while Class C, like Southwest Africa, were basically to be treated as annexed. British Tanganyika. Well, Britain already had a colony called East Africa. A new name was in order. Proposals included Smutsland, after South African General Jan Smuts, New Maryland, after then Queen Mary, and Victoria after the lake. The Colonial Office recommended a native name be chosen, like Kilimanjaro or Tabora. Finally, they settled on the Tanganyika territory after the lake. And here, immediately after the First World War, the British Empire, upon which the sun never sets, reached its greatest extent. A quarter of the world's land and a quarter of the world's people were ruled, directly or indirectly, from London. Britain finally had a continuous tract of land to build that fabled railway from Cape to Cairo, as was the late Cecil Rhodes' dream. Sadly, the railway was never built, with financial constraints increasing with the Great Depression. Thus was an optimistic idea of the 19th century swept away in the more cynical and turbulent 20th. 1920, the British East Africa Protectorate was renamed the Colony of Kenya. The Zanzibari strip folded in as the Protectorate of Kenya. On paper, it remained the Sultan's land, but for all intents and purposes, it was lost. Britain relied heavily on local chiefs to shoulder the burden of managing such a large and remote territory, and organized a governing council including Indians. Indians had been present in Tanganyika since the Middle Ages, and under colonial rule became a wealthy class of urban merchants and shop owners. The British also built schools and hospitals, and during the Second World War efforts were made to grow wheat for the war effort. Tanganyikan soldiers fought for the Allies in such places like Somaliland, Madagascar, even Burma. After the war, Tanganyika became a UN trust territory, and the beat of decolonization meant sooner or later a war-torn, broke Britain would have to withdraw. Britain wished to be deliberate in its policy, hoping to buttress the young countries from communist influence and racial tensions, a matter complicated from the large population of not only Indians, but also whites in the country. Educated blacks drifted to African nationalism, chafing at colonial rule and petitioning for faster self-government and independence. In Tanganyika, they were represented by Julius Nyerere. If South Africa had managed to integrate with Southern Rhodesia, or the Central African Federation managed to stick, there's no reason to think Britain wouldn't have done something similar in East Africa, and maybe even created a mega-dominion, like in African Canada or Australia. This didn't happen, but Julius Nyerere didn't hate the idea. United Republic of Tanzania. Tanganyika finally became independent on December 9, 1961. Initially as a constitutional monarchy under Queen Elizabeth II, but Nyerere became president of a new Republic of Tanganyika the next year. He also made Swahili co-official with English. Nyerere also called a meeting with the leaders of Kenya and Uganda to discuss a true independent East African federation, aiming to create a strong regional power similar to Barthelemy Boganda's unified Central Africa. Ultimately, neither's heart was really in it, and the idea fell through. Nyerere scored a victory, however, with Zanzibar. Britain formally granted independence to the Sultanate in 1963, and with Kenyan independence the same year, Sultan Jamshid had to accept the official loss of the African mainland. Shorn of all ties to Africa itself, the Arab and Indian elite of Zanzibar began pivoting towards relations with the Arab world, as represented by President Nasser of Egypt. Political power firmly in the minority's hands, the black majority of the islands rose in revolt in 1964, preferring closer ties to Tanganyika. Thousands died, thousands more fled, and the Arab-Indian elite was permanently broken. But this was the Cold War, after all. The revolutionaries may or may not have been backed by the Soviets. Either way, the Western powers began devising plans to prevent a communist takeover. Neither the new Zanzibari government nor that of Tanganyika wanted either power bloc to stick their noses into their affairs. So, Nyerere and President of Zanzibar Abeid Karume agreed to union. Zanzibar was annexed to Tanganyika April 26 as an autonomous region, and October 29th, the country was officially renamed the United Republic of Tanzania, Jamhuri ya Muungano wa Tanzania in Swahili, combining Tanganyika and Zanzibar. Julius Nyerere proceeded to consolidate power under the Chama cha Mapinduzi, the Party of the Revolution. A country of over 100 ethnic groups and two major religions, in his view, could only be united under a strong hand, and 1977 saw one-party rule institutionalized. Nyerere's Arusha Declaration established his ideology of Ujamaa, fraternity, for a democratic, socialist, and self-reliant Tanzania. Easier said than done. Nyerere prioritized rural communities, neglecting the urban centers like Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar. Nationalization of banks and business scared away foreign investors and expertise, and a failed communalization of villages saw agricultural production plummet. From a population of 11 million at independence, growth exploded to over 30 million by the end of the century, creating famine that only foreign aid could alleviate. Drought didn't help things either. More people for the state to manage, bureaucrats decided it was easier to just embezzle much of the money excessive taxation provided, leading government officials to be derided as the people of the Mercedes-Benz. Tanzania's financial woes were compounded by the 1978 Ugandan invasion under Idi Amin. Tanzania was victorious by 1979, but it cost the government $500 million it didn't have. The CCM was losing confidence in Nyerere, and he finally resigned in 1985, leaving Zanzibari Ali Hassan Mwinyi to win election. Seeing the writing on the wall, he began free market reforms to invite foreign loans and investment. In the waning days of the Cold War, feeling it safe to come out, as it were, Zanzibar petitioned for an independence referendum. Zanzibar had suffered neglect and economic decline in this union. Of course, Tanzania said no. As so happens with many of these African countries, the magic year of 1991 convinced the government to reevaluate the efficacy of one-party rule. 1992, it was officially repealed, and 1995, the first multi-party election since 1962 was held. The CCM still won, with noted irregularities, this time under Benjamin Mkapa. Under him, in 1996, the capital was moved inland to a more central location, the city of Dodoma, though the relocation of government offices has been slow. Since then, the CCM has held on to power, facing protests each election. Definitely fortifying their position, the CCM is nonetheless popular because since the 90s the economy has grown considerably. Agriculture comprises a huge part, exporting a staggering diversity of crops. Besides this, mining and natural gas are also important. Much of this product is exported to China, Tanzania's largest investor, who has had her hands in much of Africa this century. This significant economic growth has done much to alleviate poverty, but the CCM under President Magufuli has seen political and civil rights curtailed. Following his death in 2021, Madam President Samia Suluhu Hassan has continued this authoritarian direction. But, as early as 2000, Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya established an East African community, evolving into a customs union in 2005. Burundi and Rwanda joined in 2007, followed by South Sudan in 2016, Congo-Kinshasa in 2022, and Somalia in 2024. What's more, the members have all expressed interest in an actual East African federation, with a confederation step in between. A constitution was supposed to be written in 2021, promulgated 2023. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, postponed things. It's certainly an ambitious project, with ideas of bringing in the Comoros, Malawi, Ethiopia, Djibouti, even Sudan. As of early 2026, it seems everyone is dragging their feet, and nothing has really moved forward. Do I think it'll happen? Well, I'm not an expert, but Somalia and Congo are in the midst of civil wars. South Sudan is recovering from one. Rwanda has invaded the Congo, and there are stark political differences amongst the members, not to mention, 500 ethnic groups all told? I wish them all the best. Time will tell. Just like I wish Tanzania the best. It's going to some good places, it's going to some bad places. We'll see. Africa is growing past its image as a wild, dark continent of savage men and beasts. She's transitioning from her post-colonial era into a new Africa. What do you think of our first look at East Africa? Next time, we'll go northwest to the little country of Burundi. See you there.